My name is George Bew. This is a presentation of a classical unified field theory of an exploitable link between electromagnetism and gravity. And by exploitable, I mean a theory that allows scientists and engineers to actually design and build things based on this link. Just a little bit about myself. I worked at Lockheed Martin for 33 years and retired in 2014. I was an electronics senior staff electronics engineer and worked in the flight simulation lab, which later combined with the systems integration lab. And I would design equipment for testing all the aircraft systems on the simulator before they would go into flight. Around 1996, I started the Vasantcorp Corporation, and I've been doing research of a lot of devices that claim they output anomalous electrical power from no apparent source, and the ones that output more power would experience weight loss. At one point during my research, another department at Lockheed Martin contacted me, and the individual said he would like me to join his department and help them find everyone in the world who has successfully built one of these devices. And from the description of what they do in his department, it sounded like they were also under government contract to review all patents and determine which patents should have secrecy orders placed on them for national security reasons. And he was bragging about a lot of the technology that they had access to that he said was so advanced it would seem like science fiction. This theory of gravity was presented on YouTube in 2016 in a set of 3 videos. Those have since been combined into one video, and interested people can download it from our company website. The theory proposes that classical electrodynamics works better than quantum electrodynamics or quantum chromodynamics at explaining how gravity arises from interactions between subatomic particles within atoms. One of the main differences between a quantum and a classical electron are the spin axis of a quantum electron is considered to be either up or down, whereas a classical electron, its spin axis is actually off at an angle and continuously precessing around a precession axis. Then in addition, between the two, there have historically been a lot of incorrect characteristics assigned to a classical electron, which were later found to not be possible, and then that was used as reasoning why scientists cannot keep going along with a classical version and have adopted the quantum version instead. The characteristics of a quantum quark are considered to be intrinsic, with no processes that explain them. For example, gluons radiated or received from a quantum quark are considered to have a characteristic of helicity, but no process to explain that, whereas a classical quark helicity would probably just be circularly polarized electromagnetic energy. A classical quark, the strong force, rather than being due to a new force carrier of gluons, would most likely be just due to gamma rays. And the exchange of gamma ray energy would have a relative phase associated with the gamma rays, which could explain the color attribute that is assigned to the quantum version of a quark. Before adopting quantum theory and quantum electrodynamics, scientists had certain assumptions about a classical version of an electron. And one big one was that if an orbital electron was moving around in its orbital and precessing as it moves around, these motions would cause it to radiate away electromagnetic energy, and the energy equivalent of its mass would eventually all be dissipated and it would cease to exist. And so this was one reason the classical model was abandoned and people started adopting more of a quantum explanation. But the theory I'm trying to put forth today is that we should keep going forward with that assumption that electrons and all charged particles do radiate away energy all the time. However, they're also absorbing energy from all other similar radiating particles. And this causes them all to have forces applied to them by the absorbed energy that ends up making all of their motions more harmonious and more synchronized with each other, such that they sustain a sea of standing waves among all of them throughout the universe. And I'm contending that a similar thing can happen with quarks, but at much higher frequencies and much higher energy levels. The Stern-Gerlach experiment is an example of having wrong expectations of a classical electron. Regardless of what precession axis orientation electrons have as they enter the device, the magnetic field of the device would cause the precession axis to immediately be aligned with the device's magnetic field. Some electrons in a spin-down orientation would precess in that orientation due to the exchange of electromagnetic energy with other electrons both near and far. Both the up and down spins are precessing at discrete amounts of total angular momentum due to good old-fashioned classical electromagnetic exchange of energy with electrons near and far due to the spin and orbital motions of all electrons and with a sea of standing waves created by these motions. I apologize that these narrations are kind of rough. I have a certain amount of dyslexia reading and writing, but also just between thought processes and converting them to spoken words. Anyway, classically, the reason orbital electrons precess is when they move around in their orbitals in a classical way, their motions cause the protons within the nucleus to appear to have a magnetic field from them, which then applies torque on the spin axis of the orbital electrons, and this causes them to precess. This is just like if you have a top, you're spinning a top on the ground and its spin axis is leaning over, gravity pulling on it is going to make it precess around and wobble instead of just falling over. So the same kind of thing happens with orbital electrons. Here a helium atom is used just as an example of how paired electrons in orbitals around a nucleus will have their spins compensating each other. If one electron is spin up, the other spin down per Pauli's exclusion principle. And so what happens is the precession axis orientation of one electron versus the precession axis orientation of the other electron are such that outside of the atom, the magnetic fields of those two electrons will compensate each other, so you don't see it outside of the atom. When any particular orbital has an electron that has no pair, it's an unpaired electron, then that missing other electron cannot compensate its magnetic field. And so the unpaired electron's magnetic field then becomes visible outside the atom. So if a lot of them are all pointing the same way, then we call that a magnet. We can see the magnetic field external to that. And we can also interface with the precessing portion of that magnetic field using electron spin resonance techniques. There's a vector portion of an electron's magnetic field that is always aligned with its precession axis. There's another vector portion of an electron's magnetic field that is continuously precessing around the precession axis. Even when electrons are paired in orbitals around a nucleus in atoms, this continuously precessing vector portion of each electron's magnetic field is not fully compensated by the other electron during all 360 degrees of each precessional rotation. With all paired electrons of similar orbitals of all atoms in the universe, these vector portions are free to radiate and absorb electromagnetic energy between each other. Okay, so if we analyze the vector portion of the magnetic field of all orbital electrons that are paired up spin and down spin around the nuclei of all atoms everywhere, you see that one precesses clockwise and the other counterclockwise as you look down into the z-axis, the up or down spin axis of precession. So this diagram shows 4 slices in time, t0 through t3. So at t0 and t2, those magnetic field vectors are both pointing in the same direction, first in one direction and then in the opposite direction. Whereas at T1 and T3, they point in opposite directions, and so outside of the atom, those magnetic fields compensate each other. However, at T0 and T2, they don't compensate each other, and so they radiate first one direction magnetic field and then the opposite direction magnetic field. The purpose of this diagram is just to kind of give an alternate viewpoint of the same idea put across in the previous slide. Lots of atoms have lots of different orbitals and there are lots of different shapes, and so the point of this slide is regardless of what the shape of the orbital is, regardless of where the up and down spin electrons are relative to each other in the various orbitals, there's always going to be four positions that are similar to what this diagram shows, where they will have their precessing portion of their magnetic fields pointing the same way at two different points in time, and at two other points in time, that precessing portion of the electron's magnetic field will point opposite directions. So in this diagram, again, at T0 and T2, the magnetic fields point the same way. They don't compensate each other, and so they are visible outside the atom at the frequency of precession. And at T1 and T3, they do compensate each other, and so you don't see that magnetic field outside of the atom. The previous two slides focused on what's going on with the magnetic field component of the precessing portion of paired electrons around all atoms, but there's also an electric field component. Just like when an old-fashioned generator or dynamo is turning, when its magnetic field is pointing a certain direction and rotating, then it generates an electromotive force that's at 90 degrees to both the direction the magnetic field is pointing and the direction that it's moving. So in this case, it generates an EMF in and out of the screen. So in this diagram, at T0 and T2, when one magnetic field is rotating one direction and the other magnetic field from the other electron is rotating the opposite direction, they end up creating EMFs in opposite directions, so they compensate each other. However, at T1 and T3, they create EMFs that are up on one side and down on the other outside of the atom, and so they create small current loops. However, the main point of this slide is that at T0 and T2, you can still radiate a magnetic field outside of the atom without the usually associated electric field component. The purpose of this diagram is to try to make it clear that regardless of how paired electrons are positioned relative to each other in their respective orbitals, regardless of the shape of the orbitals also, they will always sequence through these four positions where at T0 and T2 they will make compensating EMFs, and at T1 and T3 they will create small current loop EMFs, either outside of the atom or maybe it's still within the atom and it's compensated by something else happening within the nuclei. I'm not sure. However, at T0 and T2 they definitely have compensating EMFs, and yet they radiate magnetic fields that first point one way and then the other, and they radiate outside of the atom without the usually associated electric field component. Regardless of the EMFs generated at the T1 and T3 positions in the previous diagrams, at the T0 and T2 positions, the radiated magnetic fields will toggle direction, but with the usual electric field components canceled out or compensating each other. More common transverse electromagnetic waves have the magnetic field component normal or perpendicular to the direction of propagation, but not with these waves. With these waves, the north direction toggles with or against the direction of propagation. So these waves don't induce current flow in antennas or in conductors. You have to have a magnetic field orientation that cuts across a conductor with the direction it's propagating in order to induce an EMF, but not with these waves. But still, these toggling magnetic field waves can apply torque on the rotational orientations of other magnetic dipoles, like the magnetic dipoles of all electrons. They have a spin axis and a magnetic dipole through their spin axis. The toggle frequency or frequencies should match the paired electron's precession frequency, which should depend on the orbital position, velocity, the number of protons in the nucleus, creating the strength of the apparent magnetic field that creates the precession in the first place. And I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. These unique magnetic waves are radiated and absorbed between all core electrons of similar orbitals of all atoms and applies torque, thus creating a natural tendency for all of them to move towards greater synchronization. These waves pervade the whole universe and create standing waves among all precessing electrons everywhere. Even unpaired electrons become synchronized with these waves of toggling magnetic fields. Regarding the frequency or frequencies at which these magnetic waves propagate through the universe and become part of a sea of standing waves throughout the universe, it may be difficult to define the frequency or frequencies because that's usually how many times something oscillates per unit of time. However, if at the subatomic level, the rate they're moving through time is variable, and time itself is the constant we usually go by to measure how quickly something's happening, then it becomes more difficult to define an exact frequency or set of frequencies. At the subatomic level, it could be that the rate that the electrons precess through space also determines the rate at which they move through time, and not just precessional motion, but orbital motion also. Macroscopically, we all know how to measure time and how things move through time, but at the subatomic level, it's not so easily defined. And this goes off on a tangent on some other research I've done on the nature of time itself, and there's a link to that research at the bottom of this slide. So suffice to say that even though it might seem that there should be a wide range of frequencies depending on what orbital an electron is in and how many protons are creating a specific strength of magnetic field in the nucleus and things like that, it could be they also move faster or slower through time as well, such that they all have a similar frequency or a similar set of frequencies. And that's something I don't have a final answer on myself. It's difficult, but not impossible, to detect these toggling magnetic fields that become part of the sea of standing waves among all precessing electrons everywhere. It is possible to detect them, then convert them to normal microwaves, process them, amplify them, and then retransmit them. And in fact, there's evidence that the physicist Bob Lazar back in the 1990s actually disclosed a system that did everything that I'm talking about now. So in the diagram on the upper right is a special magnetic material that detects these waves, which stimulate or resonate with the precessing motions of magnetic fields, or the electrons within the material that make its magnetic fields. They precess at microwave frequencies. They precess and counter-precess at the top of this wedge shape. And as the precession axis orientation vector portion of their magnetic fields converge from the top corners down to the bottom tip, those precessing and counter-precessing motions merge into just a single direction of rotation at the tip. And so then at the tip, it's capable of outputting just standard microwaves that we can detect. So once you've got standard microwaves, then you can amplify it, phase shift it, do anything you want to it, change its polarization, orientation, all kinds of things, and then send it to amplifiers designed specifically to re-radiate magnetic fields with the electric field component almost completely canceled out. And so Bob Lazar appeared to describe what the United States government had already built, and EG&G did the final assembly of the various systems that were probably built by various national labs in the United States and defense contractors in the United States. So the basis of this theory, just to reiterate, if according to classical electrodynamics, all precessing electrons everywhere should radiate and absorb electromagnetic energy from their orbital motion and primarily precessional motion, then they do. And the absorbed energy applies torque, and that torque pushes them into alignment or into greater synchronization of motion with each other. To the extent that these waves of toggling magnetic fields radiated from all electrons are at least somewhat in alignment or somewhat in synchronization, and to the extent that they diverge from areas of where accumulated mass, like the Earth, then that's going to create an attractive force. So it's my contention that on objects just like the Earth at sea level, we feel a force of 1g, and we attribute that to gravity. And so I'm saying that force is really just the attractive force from the diverging of these toggling magnetic fields. If you have two magnets and a magnetic field between them, and that magnetic field does not converge or diverge to any amount, they won't pull on any other magnet between them. You have to have a diverging magnetic field in order for it to be pulling something else with a magnetic field towards it. So that's what happens with the Earth. These toggling magnetic fields at very high frequencies diverge, and so then that creates the attractive force. And yes, gravity is a warp in space-time, and so it is my contention that these high-frequency toggling magnetic fields in some way create this warp in space-time. On the previous slide and on this slide, in the diagram of the Earth and the arrows toggling direction as they go out from the Earth, That's meant to represent how magnetic fields toggle direction as they propagate away from accumulations of mass. And one concern people have is that the arrows do not show closed loops, however, magnetic fields form closed loops. And so this slide is just meant to address that concern and point out that even when we create diagrams of transverse electromagnetic waves, the diagram does not show closed loops for the magnetic fields either. It's just understood that in real world that's the way they are, and this is just a limited representation showing their initial direction and direction of propagation. So with a lower diagram of the Earth, it's trying to make it clear that the magnetic fields are propagating out away from the Earth and are oriented with or against the direction of propagation. But the complete magnetic field loops are not shown, just like they're not shown in a diagram of transverse electromagnetic waves. The energy within these toggling magnetic fields is propagating outward away from accumulations of matter, like the Earth, for example, but there's also an equal amount of energy propagating inward from all other matter. And these toggling magnetic waves in both directions are creating part of the whole sea of standing waves among all matter. And they're not in perfect synchronization, and to the extent they're not, there'll be spin waves moving through these standing waves. And years ago, when trying to come up with the best name for technology related to interfacing with this sea of standing waves, for creating what people sometimes call free energy devices or for creating gravity modification devices, this was my reasoning for calling it spin wave technology. But nowadays, I call it gravity modification technology just because it gets people's attention a lot better. For this classical unified field theory, the difference between the gravitational force and the electromagnetic force is actually hardly any difference. They're both based on the same basic characteristics of space itself. Space itself is an elastic, stretchable, compressible, warpable medium, as characterized by its coefficient of capacitive permittivity and its coefficient of inductive permeability. These two coefficients determine how quickly a stretch or compression of space-time will propagate. And we call that the speed of light. In flat space-time, it has a specific value, and these two coefficients determine that value. So an electric field may be a warp in space-time in which electromagnetic energy propagates faster or slower through space, but proportionally faster or slower through time as well. However, with a gravitational field, there may be a disproportionate rate at which electromagnetic energy propagates through space versus how fast it propagates through time. Something about the permeation of space by these standing waves of magnetic fields causes this disproportionate warp around accumulations of matter. There is the possibility that quarks can be explained in a more classical way. They might be precessing and exchanging electromagnetic energy in a way similar to electrons, but possibly at the frequency of gamma rays or even cosmic rays. The nuclear strong force might just be caused by these very powerful electromagnetic forces, keeping quarks precessing only in those positions where the wavelengths and phases of their exchange energy matches their positions in precessional motions. Any deviation in position of a quark would be stifled by the absorbed electromagnetic energy applying forces to maintain the most in-phase positions. Another portion of this much higher frequency electromagnetic exchange will be radiated and absorbed among all other quarks in the universe. And this would create a much higher frequency and a lot higher energy component to the universal sea of standing waves among all matter. This, in fact, might explain the force of inertia. Imagine a two-dimensional array of magnets spinning end over end, as a simplified analogy of what's really happening in 3 dimensions, with the precessing vector portion of magnetic dipoles of any type of charged particle. It takes time for the electromagnetic energy to propagate from one spin to the next. Each magnet assumes a spin phase that is the most in sync with electromagnetic energy arriving from all the other spinning magnets. To the extent that it is in sync, it'll feel minimal amount of force on it. However, if we physically push a spinning magnet to a new position relative to all the other spinning magnets, then it won't be in phase anymore, and to the extent that it's out of phase, it'll feel force on it trying to adjust its spin until it gets back in phase again. And that force getting it back in phase is also resisting its being moved to the new position. This electromagnetic interaction between all charged particles of all matter and with a universal sea of standing waves is what Ernst Mach alluded to as necessary to cause matter's characteristic of inertia. The following example demonstrates what Ernst Mach meant. If a person is at relative rest in outer space and holding two buckets and she observes the universe rotating, then she also notes that she feels a force pulling the buckets away from her. If a person is at relative rest in outer space and holding two buckets and she observes the universe is not rotating, then she also notes that she does not feel a force pulling the buckets away from her. Ernst Mach concluded there must be some interaction between her mass and the mass of the universe to cause this force, some interaction that communicates the spin of the mass of the universe relative to a local orientation and vice versa. When I presented this theory in 2016 in a set of 3 videos uploaded to YouTube, I anticipated certain objections people may have, and I tried to address those objections. And because my presentation time is limited, I'm not going to go into all of those right now. But you'll notice on the slides there's hyperlinks, and these go back to the original parts of the YouTube videos. So if you're interested, please see my extended discussion of all this at each of those hyperlinks. This slide relates to the fundamental assertion of this presentation that energy can be radiated or absorbed in the form of magnetic waves without an electric field component associated with them. Professor Mike Underhill, who's also an amateur radio operator, in his publication, The Truth About Loops, documented his research with magnetic loop antennas, and he documented discrepancies of up to 30 dB between measured antenna efficiency and what Maxwell's equations say should be possible. Maxwell's equations are only for transverse electromagnetic waves and not the radiation of any other form of waves. It's my contention that Mike Underhill has inadvertently proven that not only can electromagnetic energy be radiated in the form of transverse electromagnetic waves that induce current flow in receiving antennas, but that magnetic energy can also be radiated in what is usually considered a mag loop antenna's null direction. It is my contention that in this case, although the magnetic energy doesn't induce current flow in receiving antennas, it can still apply torque on magnetic dipoles at a distance. Just to give you some background information on Professor Mike Underhill, he's an amateur radio operator with call sign G3LHZ, and previously he was director of the Systems Division of Phillips Research Laboratories in Red Hill. He was also technical director at MEL Crowley, advisor to the UK Ministry of Defence through the UK Defence Science Advisory Council, also advisor through QNetiQ, formerly DERA, and DSTL. And he worked through the University of Surrey at Guildford in the UK for nearly 40 years. And if you want more information on Professor Underhill and his publication, please see the hyperlinks below. The present-day version of Maxwell's equations don't do a good job of representing magnetic waves that can apply torque but don't induce current flow. Maxwell's original quaternion equations might work better if their results include the possibility of negative directions in time. And that was actually one of the reasons why the quaternion form of his equations was abandoned in the past, because it would get results that included imaginary directions in time, which people assumed were not possible. In addition to accurately modeling how electromagnetic energy propagates through time and space, the use of a simple T for time might not work either. Please study the research paper, The Nature of Time, to see how to more accurately represent time in math equations. And this all relates to an old research paper when I first started studying all these things. It was about how things move through time. I'm not a math expert, but I came up with an equation that I think accurately describes how matter and energy move through time versus how they appear to move through time at the macroscopic level. This slide is about a phenomenon known as spin superradiance. And if you're not familiar with what that is, please see that hyperlink on the first bullet and study it. So within a spin superradiance cavity, many uncompensated spins are stimulated to switch back and forth between up and down spin. When they transition within the resonant cavity, they emit gigahertz to terahertz range emissions that stimulate most transitioning spins to all radiate in phase, thus making extremely powerful RF pulses. So I'm mentioning that as a way of understanding how all electrons in the universe behave. All electrons, paired and unpaired, can be thought of as already in sync with a spin superradiance among all of them in the universe. They're in all directions forming standing waves, so we don't see them. In a spin superradiant cavity, we momentarily see the spin superradiance when all the uncompensated electron spins are forced to break lock with their transmission and reception between each other throughout the universe and instead radiate isolated in the cavity. Despite all the experimental data to the contrary, it is my contention that the states of entangled events are already set before measurement and that Einstein was correct that there are hidden variables. Example variables are relative precessional rotational phases and directions of motion through time as matter or energy move through space. It is also my contention that John Bell may have made some subtle reasoning errors and or wrong assumptions in driving the math to determine if hidden variables exist. It's also my contention that subtle errors may have been made in implementing experiments to verify John Bell's theorem. And a related video about that is there in the slide also on YouTube. There may also be wrong assumptions regarding which direction information travels through time while the information is traveling through space, and a misunderstanding of how we perceive things to move through time macroscopically versus how things really move through time at the atomic or subatomic level. As it turns out, the theory of gravity and the theory of inertia presented in this presentation correlate very closely with the gravity B waves and the gravity A waves described by the physicist Bob Lazar many years ago. Some of you may remember Bob Lazar as the physicist who claimed to be reverse engineering extraterrestrial flying saucers in a secret government program. However, it's my contention that Bob was given a lot of erroneous information about ETs, and in fact this technology was developed right here on Earth by the Department of Naval Intelligence and the CIA. As far back as the 1920s, private U.S. citizens had been stumbling across inventions that created electrical power from no apparent source. And since that time, there have been a lot of inventors. Some of them also noticed that some of their inventions, when they drew a lot more power from their device, it would start losing weight as well. And the U.S. government and private industry has been secretly researching all this for many decades. After my own personal 7 years of research, I've come to the conclusion that some of these devices really work. And one thing that helped me along with that conclusion was that the government was actively tracking down people who had successfully built these devices. I do not expect to make an announcement of a free energy device of my own design or to demonstrate something for anybody until the U.S. President issues an executive order banning all U.S. government agencies from placing secrecy orders on such devices. It's my belief that the President is getting false briefings that identify this technology as extraterrestrial when we have developed it ourselves right here on Earth. And that's not to say that ETs don't have it also, but there's no need to attribute it all to ETs when there's a lot of evidence that we've developed it right here on Earth ourselves as well. For many decades, scientists have been listening to the cosmos, searching for signs of intelligent life. But extraterrestrials might not be using the form of electromagnetic communications that we have assumed is the only way possible. In this regard, all our efforts have been using transverse electromagnetic waves. Our search for ET communications might be more fruitful using magnetic waves in which the electric field components are canceled out. These waves can propagate through the fabric of spacetime more easily. These waves don't induce current flow in receiving antennas, but they can apply torque on magnetic dipoles that can be converted back into electrical signals. It may turn out that telepathic communication between intelligent life is nothing more than spread spectrum magnetic wave communication. This theory explains gravity in a classical way as caused by electromagnetic interactions among orbital electrons of all atoms. Electron pairs in their orbitals will precess and counter-precess while they move in a classical way in their orbitals, and these motions will cause them to both emit and absorb electromagnetic waves among all electrons everywhere. This also causes a natural tendency for them all to move towards perfect synchronization. The emitted electric field components of these waves will have a natural tendency to cancel out, while the magnetic field components will add together, forming magnetic waves with the usual electric field components missing. As these magnetic waves diverge from accumulations of atoms, it creates an attractive force that we recognize as gravity. Gravity is still a warp in space-time, but it is these unique magnetic waves creating that warp. And the only difference between the gravitational force and electric field force is the electric field force can be thought of as a warp that's proportional in both time and space, whereas gravity is a disproportionate warp between space and time. There's more in one than the other.